to finish up that last section, the founder effect is the reason why we get a relatively high frequency of some inherited disorders like polydactyly, additional digits, in some human, small human populations, like the Amish, for example. So the founder effect is what occurred with Darwin's finches. So on the mainland of South America, there was a small group of finches that managed to get over to Galapagos some number of years ago, millions of years ago, and that one population of finches was the founding colony, and it had a different allele frequency than the larger population of finches that was on the South American mainland. So then that founding colony then dispersed among the different Galapagos Islands and started eating different resources and started adapting to its individual habitats within the Galapagos Islands. And then speciation events occurred, and we have about the 13 species of finches today on the Galapagos Islands. But that was an example of a founder effect. Right? Relatively few individuals from a population colonizes a new habitat. Okay, gene flow, another way of changing allele frequencies, and this is genetic exchange with another population of the same species. And this happens from time to time. So this may result with the gain or loss of alleles and tends to reduce genetic differences between populations. So on the mainland of North America, there's a population of plants that are referred to as tarweeds. Over multiple times in the past, some members made it over to the Hawaiian Islands, probably as seeds in the guts of birds. And then when they arrived to the Hawaiian Islands, those small representatives, small individuals from the larger population on the mainland of North America adapted to the various habitats on the islands, Hawaiian Islands. But then on occasion, more individuals came over, again, most likely brought over by birds, and those individuals brought in their alleles to mix with the changing alleles of the population in the Hawaiian Islands. So it's gene flow, the occasional addition of genetic variation from one population to another, and they're usually isolated. Okay, this happens with plants through pollinization. So pollen can get blown hundreds of miles and can actually incorporate genetic information from one population of trees to a distant population of trees, or things like insects, butterflies. Butterflies are isolated somewhat in places due to mountain ranges. So on occasion, individuals can get across the mountains to add their genetic material to populations of the same species that are somewhat isolated. So again, gene flow is a good name for this type of change in allele frequencies in populations or within populations. Okay? This happened with humans. As humans evolved and moved out of Africa and colonized Europe and Asia, eventually made it all the way over to the Pacific Islands, Australia, and all the way over to the New World, to the Americas. Subsequent waves of humans that left Africa interbred with populations of humans that had left Africa earlier. So that was a mixing of genetic information, gene flow, between isolated populations, in this case of humans. Okay? And then later on, once the humans were established in North America and South America, the Native Americans, another example, another event of gene flow occurred when the Europeans came over, right? The discovery of the New World, and those Europeans interbred with the humans that were in the Americas, causing the mixed races that we have throughout North America and South America and Central America. A human example of gene flow. So, closer look here. Only natural selection consistently leads to adaptive evolution. So evolution that results in a better fit between organisms and their environments. So natural selection is a huge component of evolution. So, for example, the blue-footed booby, that's a bird that exists in the Pacific, is a great example of adaptations for its home environment, its habitat in the Galapagos Islands. The body's bird and bill or beak are streamlined because the way this bird feeds is it dives into the water to catch fish. Notice how it pulls its wings back in nice streamlined feature as it enters into the bird. Its large tail will function as a brake once it's in the water, hopefully once it catches a fish. And the reason it's called the blue-footed booby is because during the courtship rituals, females choose males that have nice bright blue feet. And this is actually something called sexual selection that we'll talk about in a subsequent chapter. So the nice example of natural selection in the blue-footed booby, but we could find thousands of examples in nature. So survival of the fittest, this terminology, it's misleading biologically. So survival of the fittest, you might think of the strongest, the fastest, the bravest, but that's not always the case. If you think of a garden slug, what makes it so fit? It does really well, and if you grow vegetables, the garden slug is like, slimy Godzilla that's eating your vegetables. How can it possibly be fit? But it does really well. So fitness, biologically speaking, is how well an individual produces offspring and contributes its genetic material to the subsequent generations and populations within its population of its species. So relative fitness is a contribution that an individual makes to the gene pool of the next generation of the species relative to contributions of other individuals. So what we're looking at here is how well do individuals in a population successfully reproduce and pass on their genetic material to the offspring and to subsequent generations. We all know that even within human populations, some individuals are more successful at mating than others, and some individuals have more offspring than others. So relative fitness, if we look at this simple example, this dolphin, if it has 4 offspring, and this dolphin has 3 offspring, the relative fitness, and that is the average, 3. This dolphin does better than the average, it has 4 offspring. If we consider the relative fitness of this individual relative to the population fitness, its relative fitness is 1.33. Don't worry about the math, but it's above 1. That means it's contributing more to the genetic makeup of the population because it's more successful at reproducing. So it has higher fitness or relative fitness than the average member in its population. And if it does this because it has some adaptive characteristic that allows it to survive and reproduce better, then that characteristic is going to be more prevalent in subsequent generations, and then that's going to drive evolution. So 3 general outcomes of natural selection. So if we consider a graph for the fur coat, the phenotype of a population of mice, you will get most likely what's called a bell-shaped curve, right? Normal distribution. If you get a big enough population of individuals, most of them will have the average fur coat, and some will have the extreme fur coat. Relatively few white, relatively few really dark. So if natural selection favors a certain phenotype over others, the population of that mice will change over generations to favor that phenotype that's selected for, and we'll get 3 general outcomes that tend to be possible in this population. One outcome is directional selection. So it shifts the overall makeup of a population to favor one phenotype or one extreme. In this case, the darker ones are favored, right? Maybe the environment's darker, more vegetation, and the predator is going to have a harder time seeing the darker individuals. So natural selection is pushing towards directional selection, or natural selection is occurring through directional selection. Okay, one extreme is favored. Disruptive selection can lead to a balance of the 2 extremes, and the average phenotype is selected against. So this is possible. You'll get more of the lighter, more of the darker ones, but relatively few of the average colored ones. And then the third possibility is stabilizing selection, where the average phenotype is selected for and the extremes are selected against. And this tends to occur in relatively stable environments, is usually the most common type of natural selection outcome. Okay? So sexual selection is a type of natural selection in which individuals with certain traits are more likely than others to obtain mates. And just think about the people you've known in terms of human populations. Some people are more successful at obtaining mates than others for various characteristics, various reasons. So this leads to what's called sexual dimorphism often in nature, and it's a distinction in appearance between males and females. So in bird species, often sexual dimorphism is very obvious, where the male tends to be very colorful and has a more attractive song versus the female. One reason why is the female often chooses the mates, and the more colorful ones, usually because they're healthier, tend to be more successful reproducing. And over generations, what happens is the coloration becomes more pronounced and striking in male birds versus female birds. Sexual dimorphism is actually probably the most likely explanation for the long necks on giraffes. Female giraffes tend to like males with slightly longer necks. So over generational time, you get this extreme sexual dimorphism, or at least the extreme phenotype in the long-necked giraffes. So sexual selection is a pretty strong selective force. In some species, competition even occurs within the same sex, usually males, when they're competing for females. In a more common type of sexual selection, individuals who use one sex, usually the females, are choosy in selecting their mates, like we see here with these birds. And that's highlighted in things like peacocks, where it's the male peacock with the elaborate tail feathers that it struts around and more prominent coloration of its feathers to attract the female who does not have that long, elaborate tail. So it's the females that choose the mates in this species, and the females, for whatever reason, like this nice, big, elaborate courtship display with this nice, big, elaborate tail, and the males with the more colorful tail, healthier males, tend to be more reproductively successful. And that's it for this chapter.